What happens when a calm, composed Hollywood star suddenly finds himself in the middle of a heated daytime debate that spirals off script? Make sure to subscribe to the Star Talks and like and comment for more talk show coverage. The camera opens on the familiar set of The View. The audience is already warmed up, light applause rolling as the hosts settle into their seats. Whoopi Goldberg sits at the center, calm as always, shuffling her cards slightly before glancing toward the guest chair. "All right," Whoopi says, her tone relaxed but authoritative. "We've got a very special guest today. You've seen him in everything from epic fantasies to big Hollywood blockbusters. Please welcome Orlando Bloom." The audience breaks into applause as Orlando walks out, smiling politely, waving with a slightly reserved energy. He shakes hands with the hosts, exchanges quick greetings, and takes his seat. Thank you, Orlando says, nodding toward the audience. "That's very kind." Whoopi leans slightly forward. "So, Orlando, it's been a while since you've been on a talk show like this. You've been busy, films, family life. How are you feeling these days?" "I'm good," Orlando replies, relaxed. "I've been focusing more on balance, Less noise, more intention." There's a soft murmur of approval from the audience. One of the co-hosts jumps in. "You've also been more vocal lately. Interviews, podcasts, talking about personal growth, politics, even social responsibility. That's new for you." Orlando nods. "Yeah, I think as you grow older, you start to realize you have a platform, and it's not just about entertainment anymore." Whoopi tilts her head slightly. "But that can be tricky, right? Because people don't always want actors telling them what to think." A few audience members clap lightly at that. Orlando smiles, but there's a hint of tension. "Sure, but I'm not telling people what to think. I'm just sharing my perspective." Whoopi responds quickly. "But when you're in your position, your perspective carries weight. Whether you intend it or not, it influences people." Orlando leans back slightly, crossing one leg over the other. "I understand that. But I also think silence can be just as powerful, and sometimes more harmful." There's a noticeable shift in the room. The audience quiets a bit. Whoopi raises an eyebrow. "Harmful?" "Yeah," Orlando says. "If you have a voice and you choose not to use it, especially on issues that matter, then what are you doing with that privilege?" A co-host interjects, trying to keep things balanced. "But some would argue that people come to actors for escape, not guidance." Orlando turns slightly toward her. "And I respect that. I really do. But the world doesn't stop being complicated just because we want entertainment." Whoopi leans forward now, her tone sharpening just a touch. "But not everyone is equipped to speak on everything. That's the concern." A few audience members clap again, louder this time. Orlando nods slowly. "I agree. But I don't speak on everything. I speak on what I care about, what I've taken time to understand." Whoopi doesn't respond immediately. She looks down briefly at her notes, then back up. "So let me ask you this," she says. "Do you think celebrities sometimes overestimate how informed they are?" There's a ripple through the audience, a mix of curiosity and anticipation. Orlando pauses. It's the first real pause since he sat down. "I think everyone can overestimate themselves," he says carefully. "Not just celebrities." Whoopi gives a small smile, but it doesn't fully land. "That's a very diplomatic answer." Light laughter from the audience. "But I'm asking about your industry," she presses. "Because we've seen situations where actors speak out, and it backfires. People feel talked down to." Orlando's posture shifts slightly forward now. "And sometimes people feel uncomfortable because they're being challenged." The audience reacts, a mix of oohs and scattered applause. Whoopi nods slowly. "So you think it's about discomfort?" "I think it can be," Orlando says. "Growth is uncomfortable." A co-host jumps in quickly. "But there's a difference between growth and preaching, right?" "Absolutely," Orlando replies. "And I try very hard not to preach." Whoopi folds her hands. "But perception matters more than intention sometimes." Orlando exhales slightly, a small smile forming. "That's true. But should fear of perception stop people from speaking honestly?" There's a brief silence. The audience is fully engaged now. You can feel it. Whoopi looks at him steadily. "It depends on how honest you're being, and whether you're informed." That lands heavier than the previous lines. Orlando's smile fades just a little. "Are you suggesting I'm not informed?" A few audience members react audibly, a soft "oh wow" from somewhere in the crowd. Whoopi doesn't back off. "I'm asking the question." Orlando nods slowly. "I think that's a fair question. But I'd say I do my homework. I don't just wake up and decide to talk about something. One of the co-hosts tries to ease the tension. Let's not turn this into a courtroom, she says with a light laugh. But the moment has already shifted. Whoopi glances briefly toward her, then back at Orlando. No one's putting you on trial. This is a conversation. Orlando responds, his tone still controlled but firmer now. It doesn't always feel like just a conversation. The audience reacts again, this time more divided. Whoopi leans back slightly, crossing her arms. Well, sometimes conversations get uncomfortable. Orlando nods. I agree. There's a brief pause, longer than any before. You can feel the tension settling into the space. Then another co-host steps in, smiling. Okay, let's take a breath here. We're going to go to a quick break, but when we come back, we'll continue this discussion, because clearly there's a lot to unpack. The audience applauds, but it's not the same light energy as before. There's curiosity now. Anticipation. As the camera begins to pan out, you can see Orlando and Whoopi still looking at each other. Not hostile, but definitely not relaxed. Something has shifted, and it's only just beginning. The camera fades back in from break, and the atmosphere is noticeably different. The smiles are still there, but they're tighter now, more controlled. The audience applause comes in, but it feels more anticipatory than celebratory. Whoopi leans forward first, reclaiming the conversation with practiced ease. All right, we're back, she says, glancing briefly toward Orlando Bloom before addressing the audience. And we're having a real conversation today. A few audience members clap, sensing exactly what that means. Orlando nods slightly, his hands now clasped together instead of resting casually. Yeah, we are. One of the co-hosts jumps in, trying to soften the tone. Before the break, we were talking about celebrities speaking out, and whether that responsibility comes with limits. Orlando, I want to go back to something you said about silence being harmful. Orlando turns toward her, grateful for the shift in tone. Right. I just think that if you have influence, ignoring important issues can feel like complicity. Whoopi tilts her head again, her expression thoughtful but firm. But who decides what's important? That question hangs for a second. Orlando responds, I think it's personal. What affects you, what you see happening around you? Whoopi cuts in gently but directly. But that's exactly the issue. What affects you may not affect someone else. And when you speak publicly, you're not just speaking for yourself anymore. The audience murmurs in agreement. Orlando nods slowly. I understand that, but I'm still an individual. I'm not trying to represent everyone. Whoopi responds almost immediately. But you do whether you like it or not. A small wave of applause ripples through the audience. Orlando exhales, this time more visibly. That's a heavy expectation to put on anyone. One of the co-hosts leans in. But it comes with the fame, right? That's part of the deal. Orlando looks at her. Is it though? Or is that something we've just normalized? That line gets a louder reaction, some applause, some hum sounds. Whoopi doesn't smile this time. It's reality, she says. You may not like it, but it's what comes with being in the public eye. Orlando's tone sharpens slightly. But accepting it doesn't mean I can't question it. There's another audible reaction from the audience, this time more divided. One co-host quickly interjects, sensing the tension building again. I think what people struggle with is when celebrities speak on issues they don't fully understand. That's where the pushback comes from. Orlando turns toward her. And that's fair. But I think people assume a lack of understanding too quickly. Whoopi raises a finger slightly, signaling she wants to jump in. Because sometimes it's obvious. The audience reacts with a mix of laughter and gasps. Orlando blinks, taken slightly off guard. Obvious? Whoopi nods. Yes. We've all seen interviews where someone says something and you go, they didn't think that through. A co-host chuckles nervously. We've all had those moments. But Orlando doesn't laugh. He leans forward now, elbows resting lightly on his knees. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but I think it's unfair to assume that every time a celebrity speaks, they're uninformed. Whoopi responds calmly. Not every time, but often enough that people are skeptical. Orlando pauses, choosing his words carefully. Skepticism is healthy. Dismissiveness isn't. That line lands. The audience reacts again, louder this time. Whoopi watches him closely. And what you call dismissiveness, others might call accountability. Orlando nods. And accountability is important. But it has to be balanced. Balanced how? Whoopi asks, leaning in. By actually listening, Orlando replies. Not just reacting. The audience claps, a bit more unified this time. One of the co-hosts tries to mediate. I think there's a middle ground here. People want authenticity, but they also want responsibility. Orlando nods. Exactly. And I try to approach things with both. Whoopi crosses her arms again, not aggressively, but thoughtfully. But intention doesn't always translate. Orlando gives a small, almost resigned smile. That seems to be the theme today. A few audience members laugh lightly, breaking the tension for a brief moment. But Whoopi doesn't let it drift too far. Let me ask you something directly, she says. Have you ever said something publicly and later realized you were wrong? The question shifts the energy again. Orlando pauses longer this time. The room goes quiet. Yeah, he says finally. Of course. I'm human. Whoopi nods. And what did you do? I reflected, Orlando replies. I listened to the feedback, even when it wasn't easy. And I adjusted. Whoopi leans in slightly. Did you apologize? Another pause. Yes, Orlando says. When it was necessary. The audience reacts, some approving, some skeptical. Whoopi raises her eyebrows slightly. When it was necessary. Orlando catches the emphasis. Yes. I don't believe in performative apologies. That line sparks a louder reaction, a mix of applause and surprised murmurs. One co-host quickly jumps in. That's interesting, because a lot of people would argue that public mistakes require public accountability. Orlando turns toward her. And I agree. But accountability has to be genuine. Otherwise, it's just noise. Whoopi shakes her head slightly. But sometimes what you call noise is what people need to hear. Orlando responds, his voice steady but firmer now. And sometimes it's just people trying to control the narrative. That line hits harder than anything before. The audience reacts loudly, a mix of claps, gasps, and a few scattered boos. Whoopi sits up straighter. Control the narrative? Orlando nods. Yeah, there's this expectation that you have to say exactly the right thing, in exactly the right way, or you're dismissed entirely. Whoopi doesn't hesitate. That's called responsibility. Orlando meets her gaze directly now. Or it's called pressure. The tension is unmistakable now. One of the co-hosts looks between them, clearly trying to step in. Okay, I think we're getting into something bigger here. But Whoopi continues. Pressure is part of life. Everyone deals with it. The difference is, most people don't have millions of people listening to them. Orlando responds immediately. Exactly. Which is why it should be handled with more nuance, not less. The audience reacts again, louder, more divided. You can hear both sides now. Whoopi leans forward, her tone more pointed. But nuance doesn't always come across in a headline, does it? Orlando nods. No, it doesn't. Then whose responsibility is that? Whoopi asks. Orlando pauses, just for a second, but it's enough to show the weight of the question. Everyone's, he says finally. The person speaking and the people listening. Whoopi shakes her head slightly. That sounds nice, but it's not how the real world works. Orlando exhales again, this time with a hint of frustration. Maybe that's the problem. The audience reacts, louder than before. A co-host raises both hands slightly. Okay, we're going to keep this going, but let's take another quick pause. Because clearly, this conversation isn't over. The audience applauds, buzzing now with energy. As the camera pulls back slightly, you can see Whoopi and Orlando still engaged, still focused, neither backing down, neither fully escalating, but both firmly standing their ground. And whatever comes next, it's going to be even more intense. The show returns from break, and this time the energy in the studio is unmistakably charged. The applause comes in louder, but it's mixed with anticipation. People leaning forward in their seats, waiting to see what happens next. Whoopi Goldberg looks directly into the camera for a brief second, then turns back toward Orlando Bloom. There's no small talk this time. So let's keep going, Whoopi says, her tone calm but firm. Because I think we touched on something important before the break. Orlando nods, sitting upright now, fully engaged. Yeah, I think we did. One of the co-hosts glances between them, half smiling. This is definitely one of those conversations people are going to be talking about. A few audience members clap in agreement. Whoopi continues, her voice steady. You said maybe the problem is how the real world works, that it lacks nuance. But the reality is, people don't always have time for nuance. They react to what they hear. Orlando responds quickly, but not aggressively. I get that, but reacting without understanding is exactly what creates division. A small wave of applause moves through the audience. Whoopi tilts her head. Or it's what creates accountability. Orlando shakes his head slightly. Accountability should come after understanding, not before it. That line lands, louder applause this time, mixed with a few skeptical murmurs. One co-host leans in. But Orlando, let me challenge you on that. In today's world, things move fast. Social media, headlines, people don't always get the full context. So shouldn't the responsibility fall more on the person speaking to be extremely clear? Orlando turns toward her. Yes, clarity matters. But perfection isn't realistic. Whoopi jumps in immediately. No one's asking for perfection. Orlando looks back at her. It feels like that sometimes. There's a pause. The audience is completely quiet now. Whoopi studies him for a moment before responding. Or maybe it feels that way because you're not used to being questioned this directly. The audience reacts, a mix of "oh" and a few claps. Orlando doesn't smile this time. I've been questioned my entire career. Whoopi nods. About your work. Not necessarily about your words. That hits differently. Orlando leans forward slightly. I've had my words picked apart plenty of times. Whoopi raises an eyebrow. And how did that feel? Orlando exhales. Honestly? Frustrating. Why? Whoopi asks. Because sometimes it felt like people were more interested in reacting than understanding, Orlando says. Like they'd already decided what I meant before I even had a chance to explain. A few audience members nod, murmuring in agreement. Whoopi responds calmly. But that's not new. That's how public discourse has always worked, just faster now. Orlando shakes his head slightly. Faster, louder, and less forgiving. A co-host interjects. That's true, but it also gives more people a voice. Orlando nods. And that's a good thing. I'm not against that. I just think we need to be more mindful about how we use those voices. Whoopi leans back, crossing her legs. But mindfulness doesn't trend. That line gets a mix of laughter and applause. Orlando gives a small smile. Maybe it should. Whoopi smiles briefly, but it fades quickly. That's idealistic. Orlando shrugs slightly. Maybe, but I don't think that's a bad thing. One of the co-hosts jumps in, sensing a slight opening. Let's bring this down to something more specific. Orlando, when you speak out on issues, do you ever worry about getting it wrong? Orlando nods immediately. Of course. All the time. Then why do it? She asks. Because staying silent feels worse, Orlando replies. At least when you speak, you open the door for conversation, even if it's messy. Whoopi leans forward again. But what if that messy conversation causes harm? The room quiets again. Orlando takes a moment before answering. Then you take responsibility for that. You listen, you learn, and you do better. Whoopi nods slowly. That sounds good in theory. Orlando's tone tightens slightly. It's not just theory. Whoopi meets his gaze. But it doesn't always play out that way, does it? Orlando holds her gaze. Not always. But that doesn't mean we stop trying. The audience reacts, more applause now, stronger than before. One co-host raises her hand slightly. Okay, I feel like we're circling something here. It sounds like you both agree on responsibility, but disagree on how it should look in practice. Whoopi nods. That's fair. Orlando nods as well. Yeah, I think that's accurate. The co-host continues, trying to bridge the gap. So let me ask both of you, where's the line? Where does personal expression end and public responsibility begin? There's a pause. Whoopi answers first. The line is when your words start affecting people beyond your intention. That's when you have to step back and think carefully. Orlando listens, then responds. I agree with that. But I'd add, you also have to trust people to engage critically, not just emotionally. Whoopi shakes her head slightly. That's asking a lot. Orlando smiles faintly. Maybe. But I think people are capable of more than we give them credit for. A few audience members clap, but others remain quiet. Whoopi gestures lightly toward the audience. Look around. You've got people here reacting in real time. Some agree with you, some don't. That's reality. Orlando nods. And that's okay. Whoopi leans in, her voice slightly more pointed again. But when millions of people are watching, those reactions multiply. Orlando responds immediately. And that's why conversations like this matter. There's a brief silence. Then Whoopi says, but conversations like this don't always happen. Orlando pauses. Maybe they should. Whoopi gives a small, almost knowing smile. You're having one right now. That line gets a strong reaction. Laughter, applause, a few cheers. Orlando smiles back, but there's still tension behind it. Yeah, I am. One of the co-hosts laughs lightly. And it's definitely not a boring one. The audience laughs, easing the tension just a bit. But Whoopi isn't done. "Let me ask you one more thing," she says, turning fully toward Orlando. "Do you think there are topics that celebrities should stay out of completely?" The question lands heavily. Orlando takes a longer pause this time. You can see him thinking carefully. "I think there are topics people should approach with humility," he says finally. "But I don't think anyone should be told to stay silent completely." Whoopi nods slowly. "Even if they're uninformed?" Orlando responds, steady. "Then the focus should be on educating, not silencing." That line draws one of the biggest reactions yet. Strong applause, mixed with a few dissenting voices. Whoopi sits back, considering his answer. That's a very optimistic view of how people behave. Orlando gives a small shrug. "Maybe, but I'd rather lean toward optimism than cynicism." Whoopi looks at him for a moment, then lets out a small breath. "Fair enough." There's a slight shift in tone, not a resolution, but a softening. One co-host quickly steps in, sensing the moment. "Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground here. But when we come back, we're going to talk about how this conversation is already playing out beyond this studio. Because people are reacting right now." The audience laughs and claps, the tension now mixed with curiosity. As the camera begins to pull back again, you can see the hosts exchanging glances, Orlando adjusting slightly in his seat, and the audience buzzing with quiet conversation. This isn't just a segment anymore. It's turning into something much bigger. The show comes back from its final break, and the energy has shifted once again. Not as tense as before, but heavier, like everyone in the room knows something significant just happened. The applause rolls in, but it's more measured now. People aren't just reacting, they're thinking. Whoopi Goldberg looks toward the camera briefly, then back at Orlando Bloom, her tone calmer, more reflective. "So, while we were on break," she begins, "our producers were already showing us some of the reactions coming in." A co-host lets out a small laugh. Which was fast, by the way. Very fast. The audience chuckles lightly. Whoopi continues. "People are already debating this conversation online. And I mean strongly." Orlando nods, a faint smile returning. "I'm not surprised." One of the co-hosts looks down at a tablet in front of her. "Yeah, it's kind of split. Some people are saying, finally, a real conversation where someone pushes back. And others are saying, this is exactly why celebrities shouldn't weigh in on serious issues." The audience reacts with a mix of laughter and murmurs. Orlando leans back slightly, his posture less defensive now. "That sounds about right." Whoopi glances at him. "Does that bother you?" Orlando shakes his head. "Not really. I mean, it's part of it, right? People are going to interpret things in their own way." Whoopi nods. "That's true." Another co-host jumps in. "But it does raise an interesting point. This conversation we're having here doesn't stay here anymore. It immediately becomes something bigger." Orlando agrees. "Exactly. And that's why I think it's important to have these discussions in a real way, not just in sound bites." Whoopi gestures slightly. "But sound bites are what people remember." Orlando smiles faintly. "Then maybe we need better sound bites." The audience laughs, the tension easing just a bit more. One of the co-hosts reads from the tablet again. Here's one comment. "I don't agree with everything Orlando is saying, but at least he's willing to engage." A few audience members clap. "And here's another," she continues. Whoopi is asking the questions people are thinking, but don't always say. That gets a louder round of applause. Whoopi gives a small nod. "Well, that's the job." Orlando looks at her. "And you're very good at it." There's a brief pause, not awkward, just real. Whoopi acknowledges it with a slight smile. "And you handled yourself well, too." The audience reacts warmly, a mix of applause and relieved laughter. One co-host leans forward. "I think what people just witnessed was something we don't see enough of, disagreement without complete breakdown." Orlando nods. "Yeah, it got intense, but it stayed a conversation." Whoopi adds, "That's the goal." "It doesn't always happen, but that's the goal." Another co-host jumps in. "Do you feel like anything changed for you during this discussion?" Orlando thinks for a moment. "I think it reminded me that perspective matters. Not just what you say, but how it's received." Whoopi nods. "That's a big one. And I'll admit," Orlando continues, "sometimes I focus more on what I'm trying to express than how it might land." The audience murmurs in approval. Whoopi responds, "That's honest. And that's important." Orlando looks back at her. "And I think you made a good point, too, about responsibility. It's easy to underestimate that." Whoopi raises her eyebrows slightly. "Well, look at that. We found some common ground." The audience laughs and claps. One of the co-hosts smiles. It only took 3 segments. More laughter. But then she adds, "Before we wrap up, I want to ask, what happens after this? Not just for you, Orlando, but for conversations like this in general." Orlando exhales lightly. "I think it continues. Maybe people watch this and think a little more before reacting. Or maybe they don't. But at least it's out there." Whoopi nods. "And maybe it encourages more conversations like this, even if they're uncomfortable." A co-host adds, "Because clearly people are paying attention." The audience applauds again. Whoopi turns slightly toward Orlando. "Any regrets?" The question is direct, but her tone isn't confrontational this time. Orlando smiles, shaking his head. "No, I think this was worth having." Whoopi studies him for a second, then nods. "Good." There's a small pause, a natural one. Then one of the co-hosts glances at her tablet again. It's still blowing up, by the way. Clips are already being shared. People are arguing in the comments. It's a whole thing. The audience laughs knowingly. Orlando chuckles softly. "That was fast." Whoopi adds, "That's the world we're in." Another co-host says, "And it's not just viewers. Other public figures are already weighing in." The audience reacts with curiosity. "Some are agreeing with Orlando about encouraging open dialogue," she continues, "and others are backing Whoopi, saying public figures need stricter accountability." Whoopi shrugs slightly. "That's fair." Orlando nods. "Yeah, it is." The co-host looks up. "So it's not ending here." Whoopi smiles faintly. "It never does." There's a brief silence, the kind that feels like a conclusion without being forced. Then Whoopi turns toward the camera, shifting into closing mode. "Well," she says, "this has definitely been one of those conversations." The audience applauds. She continues, "We didn't solve everything. We weren't going to. But we talked about it. And sometimes that's where it starts." Orlando nods in agreement. One of the co-hosts adds, "And clearly people at home have a lot to say about it." Whoopi gestures lightly toward the camera. "And we want to hear from you." The audience claps again, louder now. Orlando looks into the camera briefly, then back at the hosts, then forward again, more comfortable now than at any point since the tension began. Whoopi finishes, her voice steady and clear. "So let us know what you think. Where do you stand on this? Because this isn't just about one conversation. It's about how we all communicate moving forward." The applause swells. The camera slowly begins to pull back, capturing the entire table, the hosts, Orlando, and the audience, still buzzing, still engaged. And just before the segment ends, there's one last exchange. Whoopi glances at Orlando and says quietly, but still picked up by the mic, "You held your ground." Orlando smiles. "So did you." A small, genuine moment. The audience catches it and responds with one final round of applause. The screen begins to fade. And as it does, the sense is clear. This wasn't just another interview. It was a conversation people are going to keep talking about long after the cameras stopped rolling. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to the Star Talks for more real talk show stories.